Hello, my name is John Hathcote. I'm an assistant professor at James Madison University. I teach in our quantitative psychology master's program as well as our assessment and measurement PhD program. Today I'm going to talk about the design and implementation of mixed methods research. This is actually a workshop that I gave a version of this workshop at our Center for Faculty Innovation here at JMU, and I thought I'd go ahead and share a version of this workshop with you. So let's begin. It's really by the end of the workshop. This was a 2-hour workshop. The primary purpose of this workshop, I thought, well, what could I accomplish within 2 hours? So within that amount of time, I'm going to give you enough information so that you can actually introduce a mixed methods research proposal. So if we look at the different elements of a proposal, you can see that we will have a title, various aspects of an introduction, and that's going to be our primary focus today. So how to develop problem statements, purpose statements, looking at the rationale for mixed methods research or various rationales for mixed methods research, how that would align with different basic designs, looking at the development of research questions and hypotheses, both quantitative, qualitative, and mixed. As a part of that as well, we're going to look at the definition of mixed methods and, like I said, the different types of designs. I will briefly talk about the different worldviews or different philosophical stances, if you will, and I will also briefly talk about some additional considerations such as integration, data displays, and so forth. So, like I said, the primary focus, just to give you a general outline, we'll talk about qualitative and quantitative research, what is mixed methods research, go into problem statements, and then look at some different common rationales for actually mixing or integrating both qualitative and quantitative data. That will lead to the development of research questions, specifically research questions that are mixed methods research questions, and then we'll look at some basic mixed methods designs and how different rationales fit with each of these designs. Finally, toward the end, we'll worry about the working titles. And then, like I said, I'll briefly go into different worldviews, integration, data displays, and so forth. So to begin, I suppose, beginning with a topic like this, but I thought, well, I could pull a lot of numbers, a lot of data about violent crime rates. So a recent report from Gallup indicated that 53% of Americans are greatly concerned about crime. 71.5%, I pulled this from the FBI statistics, of murders used a firearm. We can also see that I pulled from some other sources that since 1965 there have been 141 mass shootings in the United States. In total, 874 people died, not counting the shooter. 27% of mass shootings occur in the workplace. And then if you look at the crime rates, and I believe that they break this down per 100,000, if we were to rank order the top 5 cities or the cities with the most violent crime, Philadelphia ranks the highest. This is followed by Houston, Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. I'm going to pull this out because another way of looking at this is to actually look at some graphs. And You can download all of this data, but I actually pulled this graph. Someone had already done that, so I just borrowed their graph. But one of the things that we can see is that from 1960 to, so let's say 2010, we can see very similar trends, right? So we see a peak in violent crime in the early 1990s, and since then there's been a steady decline. When I actually graphed this, I don't know if I have this pulled up or not. No, I currently don't. But I actually graphed it from, I think, 2000 to 2015 or so forth. And it's still fairly much, pretty much declining. I think that there was an increase in 2016, but overall it's a general decline. So the numbers and statistics, these types of things will give us one way of viewing data or viewing a problem. But we also have other ways of viewing a problem as well. So we might look at specific stories, and these are rather sad stories, but we can get qualitative information about the lives, the experiences, and so forth of people involved in these things. So I pulled this information from the Washington Post. They actually have a decent graphical kind of interface to look at some of these things. The youngest victim of a mass shooting was an 8-month-old who was buried with his mother, who tried to shield him as a father of 2, killed 21, and injured 19 in a busy McDonald's on July 18th, 1984. Apparently, the man told his wife that he was going out hunting humans and opened fire with these different weapons. That's a story, right? One way of looking at this type of data. Like I said, sad stories. Here we have 2 middle schoolers that at the time, one was 11, the other 13, pulled the fire alarm in Jonesboro, Arkansas, outside of a middle school on March 24th, 1998, and began shooting other children. So 10 people were wounded, 4 girls had died, and I think it says between them they had 9 guns, including 2 semi-automatic pistols. I'm not sure what constitutes an assault pistol, but anyways, both of these children were recently released when they turned 21 years old. So that's like I said, a different way, a qualitative kind of approach if we were to investigate the lives and the experiences of people who have encountered or witnessed or maybe enacted some type of violent crime. So we have the numbers that can tell us information. We also have other types of data that could give us information. So mixed methods research is basically attempting to marry both of these forms of data. So, like I said, the statistics about violent crime can give us important information. However, perhaps we can get a better understanding of violent crime or something about violent crime by combining this information with the lived experience, the stories of people involved in such events. So like I said, mixed methods is really an effort to combine both of these things so that we can develop a better understanding of a problem or phenomenon. So ultimately, oftentimes when you look at the literature, many people in mixed methods, I mean, that's one of the main arguments, right, for doing mixed methods is that, hey, we get something better or something different, a different perspective, a better perspective, a deeper perspective or understanding when we can look at a problem from both of these techniques or strategies. So in some sense, it is combining quantitative and qualitative research. Now, actually, the extent to which quantitative and qualitative research denote distinct things or distinct entities is actually controversial. Some people have argued, for example, that this is really kind of an oversimplification of research, that it fails to capture some of the nuances and subtle ways in which we might use interviews or in which we might collect data and so forth. Obviously, the presentation is not about that, though I think that's an interesting topic and perspective. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of those things, but I thought I would at least include it as something for you to think about. Broadly speaking, I suppose when I think of quantitative inquiry, I think of numerical data of some kind, right? And we can use numbers in various ways. We can use numbers to talk about measurement. We can use numbers to quantify, certain, like I said, violent crime rates. We don't have to use it in some statistical analysis, but oftentimes we would, or we do, use it in a statistical analysis so that we can make inferences from a sample back to a population. Qualitative inquiry usually involves collecting text, maybe some kind of some other symbolic information, or any other kind of non-numerical data. This data is usually used to study, let's say, the meaning of an experience, something about an environmental context, or let's say culture, and to generate theory. I pulled this definition from an article by Johnson and their colleagues. They actually have a pretty good article that looks at all the different definitions of mixed methods research and tries to combine and synthesize these into one definition. And this is a part of that I pulled. So they say, well, it combines elements of quantitative or qualitative and quantitative research for the purposes of breadth and depth of understanding and corroboration. And there may be some other purposes, which we'll get into that as well. So here we've had a sense of, well, what's quantitative inquiry, what's qualitative inquiry, what is mixed methods attempting to do. And the first thing that we need to do is to think about what type of problem am I interested in if we're going to develop a proposal. So problem statement really needs to occur fairly early in the introduction, and you can do this in a very succinct way or a more elaborate way. But typically, if you're going to write a journal article, the introduction it's not going to be very long. I guess this might vary depending upon your discipline, but most of our journal articles are not very. The introduction's maybe 1 page or 2 pages. So we try to keep it succinct and get to the point. So where do we find problems? We can test a theory. So if we have some theory about, X or violent crime, then we could test that theory. Or maybe we have 2 competing theories that we would want to test. Oftentimes we find problems by doing. I honestly think that the best way to find problems is to be immersed within a line of literature, and research is really a conversation that people have about a particular problem or topic. And you can see that there's a lot of things when you're immersed within some kind of literature or topic, then you see problems, right? There's things that need to be done, or maybe the results don't necessarily fit, right? People find conflicting results and so forth. Other times you might be facing some kind of practical issue. Maybe there's something at work or some demand for a program that needs to be investigated. Policy is another source of research. What are the implications of policy? And like I said before, or at least I implied, that oftentimes we might fill a gap, right? There's something that needs to be done that simply has not been done. And I think that the best way to achieve this really is, like I said, to be immersed within some line of literature. So here's an example of a problem statement that I pulled from an article, and then I just put into, I used different colors to indicate what was happening within each of these pieces of the problem statement. So this problem statement is about performance assessments. I actually teach a class in performance assessments, so I thought I'd pull something from that area. But here we just have an introduction to the topic. Performance assessments are usually scored with multiple raters and so forth. Then they use prior research to identify that there's a consistent problem here, right? So one of the problems that they find, or one of the findings that tends to occur in this area, is that we can handle raters and we can train raters fairly well and account for that source of error or unreliability. However, one of the things that people really don't understand is why we have what's referred to as a person-by-task interaction, and that seems to be a big part of the error that we see. And a person-by-task interaction is basically, in a very simple kind of way of thinking about it, would indicate that, well, people tend to perform differently across tasks that are designed to be similar. So I may think that, with task 1, students A, B, and C are doing great. With task 2, it all flips around, right? And understanding that is a topic of research in this area. So then they identify a need to fill a gap, right? Although most researchers acknowledge that this is a problem, they don't know how big, what's the size of this error across these different studies, so they're going to fill this gap. But here you have a nice and succinct statement of what is the problem, right, based on prior research, and then what are we attempting to do in our study. So here I would invite you to take a few moments and maybe think about, what problem are you interested in studying, or what problems are you interested in studying? Where did you locate that problem, and what ultimately are you wanting to learn from your study? So in the workshop, we'd actually take some time to go through this and get feedback from people and so forth. But for the sake of this presentation, I'll have to move on. So we need to find a purpose of our study. And whenever we are setting up the purpose for our study, we need to have some reason for collecting quantitative data. These are typically involved with addressing a research question of some kind. Why am I collecting qualitative data? Well, I'm answering a research question of some kind. And that data is going to help me address that question. But I also need some kind of statement about the reason that I'm doing a mixed method study. So I need some rationale, right, for mixing. And this rationale, which I'll address later, needs to align with the design that you're going to implement. So here we will talk about some different rationales for mixing, and then that will lead us into the different types of questions. And then later on, we'll address the different research designs. So what are some common rationales for mixing? One is triangulation, and this is a word that originally came from navigation, and in the mixed methods world, it has transformed itself. So it doesn't mean the same thing in navigation, really, as it does in the mixed methods literature. But, well, I guess in some sense you could draw a connection there, but triangulation, the way it's usually referred to in the mixed methods literature, is that we're basically wanting to see if how two things may line up, right? So I want to see if qualitative and quantitative data are giving me the same picture. Maybe they're giving me a different picture about some phenomenon, right? So an example, does my interview data, does that corroborate how people are classified using some kind of instrument? Complementarity is basically an elaboration of results, or perhaps I want to clarify some results. So I could use interview data to get a sense of maybe something odd that I found with my quantitative data. Development, basically this is when I'm using one strand of, say, quantitative or qualitative data, and that's going to inform or enhance the other strand. So I may take themes that I collect from interview data and then use those themes to develop an instrument or survey that I'm going to administer on a larger sample. Initiation, this is when I'm purposefully trying to seek, let's say, paradox or some kind of contradiction with the data. Most of my examples are going to come from quantitative measurement examples because that's where my training is primarily. So here we may take interviews, let's say from a particular group or a particular population, and we could use those interviews to investigate the meaning of a theoretical term or how that theoretical term might apply to a specific population. So for example, parenting styles, how does that apply to different populations? Or what is intelligence? How do different cultures and different people view intelligence, and how might that line up or fail to line up with the way in which we're currently measuring those things or trying to measure those things? So it may purposefully kind of seek out those contradictions or issues or whatever. So for example, we don't necessarily always care about whether they converge, but finding results that don't converge can be just as interesting, and if at times not more interesting. Okay. Those are 4 common rationales. Other people have talked about different rationales, but these are 4 that's discussed quite a bit within the literature. So those are rationales for mixing. And these are going to be connected to our research questions, which is also connected to the design. So let's look at some of the research questions. Quantitative questions, we can use that to describe something, right? So we might administer a large-scale survey to describe how a particular population views something or what they think about something. We might compare populations, we investigate patterns and relationships, and so forth. So an example, do gang members who have been arrested have higher rates of recidivism than non-gang members? Qualitative questions often, say, aim to provide further insight, more depth of exploration about some particular issue, and we can also use that to describe experiences as well, or how people view things. So one example would be, how do gang members view violent crime? Mixed methods research questions really embed aspects of both quantitative and qualitative questions into a single idea, a single problem, or a single question, right? So these are usually informed by the rationales that we previously discussed. One question might be, do gang members' views toward violent crime inform recidivism rates? Okay. So here I would invite you again to take a few minutes and respond to the following questions. What qualitative questions are of interest to you, to your problem? What quantitative questions are of interest? And what do you hope to learn from mixing the methods? Okay. Now, whenever you're thinking about the design of a mixed method study, there are various things that you need to take into consideration, or that you should take into consideration. One is basically what they refer to, or what people refer to as, a level of interaction. So this is the degree to which different methods are designed or implemented independently, right? So we may have a high level of interaction between our different strands, or they may be more independent, right, in their design and implementation. And we'll see some examples of that shortly. Priority. Oftentimes one strand, say a qualitative strand, might be more important than a quantitative strand, or a quantitative strand might be more important than a qualitative strand. So when you're thinking about your study, you want to ask, is one more important than the other, or are they both equal? And the mixed methods literature also has some notation that's typical when you're doing these things. I'm not going to actually run through all of that in this presentation, but there are different ways to indicate when you're writing this up which things have priority and so forth. Timing is the other thing, right? When is this going to happen? Which is connected to interaction and so forth. But timing of the strands, are they both going to occur at the same time? Will one occur and then the other occur? And a multi-phase is basically when I have multiple strands, right? So I have, maybe a qualitative strand that's informing a quantitative strand, that's informing a qualitative strand, and so forth, depending upon the question that we have. Then mixing. How am I going to mix? When and how does this occur? So there are different say areas or points in which mixing may occur. It may occur during the interpretation stage. It may occur during the analysis stage. So I might, quantize my interview data and use that, analyze that with other forms of quantitative data. Or it may actually occur in data collection. So I might have a qualitative strand or qualitative questions or qualitative forms of data collection that's embedded within a bigger quantitative study. Another way is that one strand will often inform the results of another strand, right? So if I'm using it, well, the mixing will occur by how those things are informing it. Then we're going to walk through a few basic designs. So the first basic design would be a convergent parallel design. So convergent parallel is basically referring to the timing of these things. So basically my quantitative data is being collected simultaneously with the qualitative data. And the convergent is that I'm taking both of these things and I'm either merging them. So like I said, I may take one form of data and transform it into another form and analyzing it together, or I'm making comparisons at that point in time. And then I need to interpret the results. So why would someone do a study such as this? Well, a couple reasons would be they need a more complete understanding of a topic, or there might be a need to corroborate the results, right? So does my quantitative data give me the same information that my qualitative data does? An example of something like this might be, at least in terms of a measurement perspective, oftentimes we'll have people do think alouds as they are answering items on a test. So here they're answering and giving quantitative information, but at the same time they're thinking aloud and giving me qualitative data. And I can use that to see how people are interpreting items, to see how, or help maybe explain why items are functioning in a particular way, and so forth. Here's a sample purpose statement that I actually pulled from a textbook, but I thought this might be helpful to some people. So basically, and you wouldn't have to use this exactly, you can always tweak these things and modify it and make it fit your writing style or what you're trying to communicate, but this is at least some language to help people do that. So we'll look at this mixed method study. We'll address something, right? Something about violent crime, let's say. I'm going to describe the design. So this particular design will be used, and we're collecting, data at the same time. So here we're going to look at, maybe some experience or some views toward violent crime, and I'm going to use this to test a theory or something along those lines, right? And then I'm going to look at the data or the qualitative. Actually, I flipped that around. I'm making sure I'm just going through this. Yeah, so I talk about my qualitative data, basically my quantitative data, and I'm doing this to compare, to corroborate, validate, compare the results of both, so that it can bring further insight and so forth into a particular problem. Like I said, this is a template that I pulled from a textbook, and I would modify these things and so forth to make it fit your situation. Okay, so here we have a second basic design referred to as an explanatory sequential design. Here I have quantitative data of some kind. I'm then going to take that and follow up with some qualitative data and then interpret those. So why would I do this? Well, I need to explain my quantitative results, or I might even do this in a way that we talked about before, where I'm kind of intentionally seeking out paradox or seeking out some kind of contradiction. So here, I might find with my quantitative data that that there's a correlation or there's a relationship between two variables, but I also see that there are some outliers. Well, I might want to talk to those people, right? Identify those outliers and try to get a better understanding of why their pattern seems to be different from other people. So here, once again, we have a template that you could use. It's basically introducing these designs. And like I said, you can take this and play with it and adapt it to fit your situation. But you at least have something to work with. Okay, with the third design, we have qualitative data. So in this case, it's an exploratory sequential design. So we start off with the qualitative data as opposed to the quantitative data. And that's going to lead to or build into some type of quantitative analysis or quantitative study. And then we would interpret those results. So here there might be a need to investigate the qualitative findings, develop a measurement tool, or maybe test a theory that was developed during the qualitative strand. I think in our, or at least I should say my area, I see this most often when people are developing an instrument. So if I don't have theory, or I don't have a sense of what a construct or psychological construct might look like or might be like, I could interview people and purposefully interview people from a certain population and get a sense of what this might look like. I could then take those themes, take those results, and then use that to write items and get a sense of how I would want to develop an instrument, right, or the different aspects of an instrument. Or some kind of survey, right? Okay. And then once again, we have a template here that you could use to talk about that. And that, like I said, that's something that you could adapt to your own situation. So here I put all of this into one slide, and it looks like quite a bit, but you can really think of this as being along, as having like 3 different studies. So if you take the first, the square, qualitative data would be before. Let's say I'm collecting qualitative data, and that would build into an intervention. So I may take qualitative data, look at particular experiences and so forth, and use that information to decide or make decisions about how to structure an intervention of some kind, an experimental intervention, right? So that would be one study. And that's the design purpose would be, well, I have a need to. I don't really know how to frame this intervention, so I'm going to take some data and use that data to frame it. Now, if you look at this middle piece, now I may take or have, collect qualitative data actually during the intervention. So I might want to explore something about the process of that intervention or the experience of that intervention while it is occurring. And use that data to basically dive into the intervention itself. So for example, oftentimes the intervention, a treatment intervention, is a kind of black box, right? That we just assume that the intervention happens the way that we want it to. So we might actually go in and take some observations or take some qualitative data of some kind, right, to actually see if the intervention is going according to plan and so forth. Now, the third option is, well, let's say I have an experimental intervention. So I've conducted my study, and then I'm going to use the qualitative data to inform or kind of follow up or explore different experimental findings. So for example, I may have not have found an effect that I anticipated. I could use the qualitative data afterwards to maybe follow up on that effect. As we mentioned before, there might be outliers of some kind. I could be interested in exploring those outliers and getting a better sense of what's happening with these people by following up with the qualitative interviews or focus groups or whatever. Okay. So now that we've talked about these different designs, I didn't actually provide a script for that. By this point in time, I think you have a sense of how we would word some of these things. So then we'll look at some titles. So Creswell, a lot of this advice about how to make a title I got from Creswell in one of his recent books that you'll see at the end. His advice is to try to create a neutral title, right? That's obviously going to communicate the topic that you're interested in, maybe something about the participants, and at the same time you're trying to convey that this is a mixed methods study. His advice would be to avoid overt, let's say quantitative or qualitative language within the title. So you might just give us something about the topic itself and then say something about the fact that this is mixed methods or looking at both qualitative and quantitative data. So some language that you may want to avoid, effect, maybe so causal language might be best to avoid unless you're doing an interventionist design. You might avoid things like relationship, right? Correlations, factor structures, those types of things. And try to find a neutral title that's just going to talk about your topic itself, your, say, dependent variable, and then something about both. I need to fix this typo here. So here are a couple examples. Unwritten rules of talking to doctors about depression, integrating qualitative and quantitative data, right? So we have the topic, I know what you're interested in, and then I can see that you're going to collect both quantitative and qualitative data. Here's another one, students' persistence in a distributed doctoral program in educational leadership and higher education, a mixed methods study. So I get a sense of your dependent variable, what you're interested in, as well as a sense that you are collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. So at this point in time, I would invite you again to think about the different design that may best fit your study. We didn't talk about a multi-phase design, but there are various designs that you could use. These are some of the most basic or let's say typical designs. And then identify as well, take the time to try to frame a title for your paper. Framing a title forces you to, in a very succinct way, give focus to the paper. What are you focusing on? So even though you're not maybe at the point yet, there are some inadvertent benefits to being able to frame a title for the project, mainly in the sense that it allows you to focus your efforts and so forth. Okay, so far we have addressed definition and aim of mixed methods research. We've looked at some problem statements, talked about your purpose, right? So what are the qualitative questions, the quantitative questions, what are some example mixed methods questions? We talked about 4 different designs and some rationales that we would use for mixing methods based on each of these designs. And then gave you some basic advice that I pulled from Creswell that's looking at how to develop a mixed methods title. So now we're going to move on to some other topics. So I don't plan to spend a whole lot of time on this, mainly because the literature, so there's a vast amount of literature that's looking at different paradigms. Some people refer to it as paradigms, some people refer to it as philosophical stances, worldviews. You see a lot of different terms within the literature. So I'm just going to use the term worldview to encompass this broad kind of perspective that would include, let's say, your theoretical framework, include your philosophical stance or assumptions, and so forth. Now, in the, let's say, 1970s, 1980s, there was basically, well, even before that, really, we start having a lot of people, especially within education, become interested in qualitative research methods. And many of these people at the time articulated a different kind of worldview that would inform these methods than what they took to be the received view of science, of quantitative inquiry. And the field of mixed methods really had to kind of justify why we would choose to combine these things, even though people have been doing it for quite some time. Mixed methods as a field or as a discipline, or maybe not a discipline, but as a community, had to articulate, well, a defense to some of these issues. Because we would have some people in the quantitative camp and then some people in the qualitative camp, and for some reason they didn't talk to each other or value the research that the other person was doing, and for a while they had what's referred to as the paradigm wars. And from that, there was this idea advanced by methodological purists referred to as the Incompatibility Thesis. And Howe summarizes this thesis as follows, and then he responds to it. He says, well, quant and qual are informed by different philosophical positions. These positions are inconsistent, so we shouldn't mix quantitative and qualitative forms of inquiry. Now, like I said, the mixed methods world had to respond to this in some way, because the whole idea of mixed methods is based upon mixing, right, these forms of inquiry. And I suppose there are different ways, if you just look at this, that you could respond to this argument, right? So you could disagree and say, well, quantitative and qualitative inquiry are not informed by different philosophical positions, right? Maybe that's a wrong assumption, or statement, or premise, I should say. Maybe you could argue that the positions are, even though they are informed by different philosophical positions, these positions are simply not inconsistent, right? So there might be some various ways to handle this situation. Or a third way, which is the way that Howe and some of the other people have taken, is that, well, maybe we can articulate a different philosophical view, worldview, or use a different philosophical worldview in which they are consistent with each other. And that's really the birth of pragmatism and mixed methods research and so forth, came from that line of thinking. The incompatibility thesis also pulls from this idea that, much of what we do is informed, whether we recognize it or not, by these underlying philosophical stances or assumptions. I may not even be aware of some of the assumptions that I make, so they might be more tacit rather than explicit, but it is most forms, I'm hesitant to say all, but it's difficult for me to find forms of inquiry, or any kind of form of inquiry, that doesn't necessarily have these tacit kind of assumptions about whether they're epistemic assumptions or ontological assumptions and so forth. So epistemology is really just a study of the nature of knowledge, knowing, what is knowledge, what does it mean to know, how do we know that we know, and so forth. These things usually inform some kind of theoretical perspective that then informs my methods. And that's the typical way that people tend to conceive these issues, right? So I have this underlying view about the nature of knowledge. Well, that's going to inform how I approach research, right? But I think that for many people, methods themselves, could have some kind of philosophical implications. Just to give kind of an extreme example, it's very rare, in fact, I've never seen a postmodernist conduct an experiment in order to examine, some kind of causal effect, right? That there are certain ideas within experimentation, such as holding particular variables constant, right? Enacting controls, randomization, and so forth, random assignment, that we're trying to achieve particular things. Now, I think that there are obviously some nuances about these methods, and I'm not going to go into all of that stuff, but there's obviously different causal theories and so forth that are consistent with these ideas, with experimentation. So these are just some examples that I pulled where we have objectivism would be in epistemology, constructionism would be in epistemology, subjectivism. And on the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit more about what these different views are. And these are just some examples of how they might inform theoretical perspectives. There's actually a really good book by Crotty that was published in 1998 that addresses a lot of these things. So I would encourage you to read that book. But to get a sense of where you might be, we can ask some questions, right? So we may ask, well, what is a tree? Or maybe what is the word tree attempting to accomplish? So A would be an objectivist epistemology. So we'd say, well, the word tree aims to refer to, let's say, inherent properties of objects. So this treeness, that's referencing these properties, that exist, let's say, independent of human consciousness. It's going to exist whether we're here to think about it or not. And what we're attempting to do is to discover or identify what these mind-independent properties of the world would be. A constructionist would have a different view. To say, well, the word tree emerges from our interaction, right? So treeness doesn't exist independent of our minds, but it's constructed from our engagement with the world. So research would aim to describe or understand these interactions, right? How the world and our interaction with the world informs, or contributes to treeness. The subjectivist would say something like this, that the word tree derives from us imposing meaning on the world. There's really not any kind of inherent treeness to discover, or interaction between some subject and object that's out there. It's very tempting to say these types of things if you're a subjectivist, or at least if you're trying to describe that view. So instead, the subject creates this, right? We impose meaning, and this is done via culture or systems of power or whatever. So research would be what we are trying to accomplish with research is that we have an effort, we want to illuminate and maybe deconstruct these systems of power. So you may find yourselves kind of leaning toward one of these views over the other, but this is just a way, a kind of a brief thought experiment. Well, which one seems to resonate with you? Most people probably intuitively they grow up as an objectivist, and then later come to question some of these things and adopt other worldviews. I'm going to give you a quick illustration of why we may be cautious, or we should be cautious about a form of naive realism, right? Naive realism being that, well, my senses give me this perfect, direct access to an objective kind of reality, or reality that's untainted by my senses. Just invite you to ask, or I would ask you here to simply look at this picture and say, well, is the top maybe more, is that a different color than the bottom square? And most people, when they look at this, would say, yes, they are different colors. They're not the same color, right? However, we can see that when we put this here, it completely shifts, right? So here it's gone, they're different. Now they're the same, they're different. Now they're the same. So what is color? I'm not going to get into all of these philosophical issues or physics issues and so forth, but it would maybe make us think about, well, what is my brain doing when I see these things? Is color an inherent property of objects? And I think that the answer is no, that they're not. Anyways, there's a long line of literature about these different philosophical stances and how they inform inquiry. I think that line of literature is interesting, but like a lot of areas, it's quite messy. People use different words and in different ways, and it's difficult to keep track of all of that sometimes. But depending upon your discipline, you may need to articulate a worldview of some kind. And at the end, I give you some various resources that describe some of these different worldviews, like pragmatism or whatever. And the extent to which this really is something you would need to do is going to vary quite a bit across different disciplines. So for example, in the health field, it may not be as common in some of those areas to have to justify or talk about your world view in medicine, let's say. Whereas in other areas, it might be, I know typically when you publish or do qualitative research, it's very common in that case for editors or reviewers to ask you to describe, your worldview. How do you think about this topic? So that gives us some sense of how you might be interpreting or thinking about the data. Okay, now I'll move on to integration. And then we'll talk about some displays and then wrap things up. So integration is basically the point of intersection between qualitative and quantitative strands of a study. So where are these things going to intersect, and how does that intersection, what does that intersection really look like? And we've alluded to some of this already. So there are different points at which this could occur. So for example, I could do it with data collection. Perhaps, as I mentioned before, a qualitative strand is embedded within a larger quantitative survey or something along those lines. The analysis itself, I could take, many qualitative people would definitely, or people who identify themselves as a qualitative researcher would probably not like some of these ideas, but you could always quantize your qualitative findings, or look at counts or those types of things within the interviews, record that, and then analyze it together. And like we said before, there's often times where the design of your study, one strand is going to ultimately inform or build into or explain a different strand. So we talked about how that could occur with both the explanatory sequential design as well as the exploratory sequential design. That also occurs when we were talking about the interventionist design, right, where we have the qualitative data, let's say, that's informing my intervention. And it can also occur at the interpretation stage. So how do I make sense of these findings? Okay. Now, one way that people have tried to communicate, and there's a lot of literature about this as well, is by doing something that's referred to as creating a joint display. So I'll look at a couple examples of a joint display that's pulled from other sources. So this was a study, well, there's actually a really good article by Fetters and his colleagues that was published in 2013 that looks at nothing but integration. So different points. I would highly suggest that for you to read that article if you're looking for different ways to integrate and mix and think about how to accomplish those things. So I pulled that from their study, and then they cite other studies and so forth. So you have, in this study, they were investigating basically beliefs about the advantages and the disadvantages of adaptive clinical trials. And they were looking at, they did a survey and they conducted focus groups with different stakeholders. And then in this display, basically what they did is it has the level, the quantitative data that's looking at the level of advantage that they have got some quantitative information on with the box plot. And they've got that across each of these groups. And then on the right-hand side, that's color-coded to align with the box plots, they have statements and that they've pulled from interviews with those different groups. So it's one way of how we can display both the quantitative data and the qualitative results within the same table. So let's look at one more example. So in this case, there was a study that they were interested in collecting some validity evidence for a working relationship scale. They interviewed key informants looking at clinical relationships. And then they took, basically, on the right-hand side, you can see quotes from low scores, high scores, and they're using those quotes to get a better sense of what the instrument is indicating to people. So are low people saying the kinds of things that we would expect them to say, and so forth? All right, so we've looked at a few examples of data using these different ways of presenting the quantitative and qualitative data within a single table. And there are many other examples that you can find in the literature. And we've walked through research purpose, how to develop research questions, and kind of the basic structure or skeleton of developing a mixed methods proposal. And we're getting towards the end of the presentation. So I'd like to say, since we are giving, I'm giving a presentation on this, that I should conclude by looking at some challenges and so forth. So one of the things that I would like to emphasize is that mixed methods research is not a cure-all. Okay, if that was the case, then you could accuse me of selling snake oil, right? So mixed methods is not going to fix everything. And it's not, if in some situations it may not be necessary, it may not be appropriate, because it's not going to help me address the questions that I ultimately have. So mixed methods is really just another tool, another way to approach research that you can use along with all the other skills that you currently have. So it's one tool among many. And when you're thinking about mixed methods research, what might be some common challenges? I think that, at least with my own experience and talking to other people and so forth, some common challenges have to do with the time that it takes. So if you're going to do a mixed methods, let's say dissertation, then you really need to think through that, right? Because you're going to have to take the time to collect both forms of data, analyze both forms of data, and make sense of that somehow. And from my own experience with qualitative analysis is difficult enough. Like I said, most of my research is quantitative. I don't do qualitative research very often. But when I have done this form of research, it is extremely labor intensive. It's time consuming. And it's a quite intense process. Right? So the time is one factor that you need to take into consideration. Do I have the resources that are necessary? Right? So do I have access to all the software that I need? Do I have access to the samples that I'm going to obtain? How am I going to accomplish these things, right? The other thing that you would need to think about as well is some of the challenges is that you have to be fairly skilled in both areas of research. Oftentimes people are primarily trained in either quantitative forms of inquiry or qualitative forms of inquiry. So you tend to get intense training in one, less training in the other, if any, in certain areas or certain programs, and that can make it challenging as well, as that I have to have skills for doing both types of research. If I don't have those skills, then I need to develop some proficiency in the areas that I have weakness in, which is going to take time, or I need to collaborate with someone who does have those skills. Those collaborative relationships are also quite interesting, primarily because Um, you may approach the topic from a particular worldview, whereas your collaborator, right, your partner, or your partners, or people on your research team may not share that worldview. So you may even think about the data in very different ways, and those make very interesting conversations as well. All right, so and that's related to the next slide. What should be some things to consider? Well, am I going to use, if I'm thinking about conducting a mixed methods research study, well, am I going to use the data to accomplish something with both of them, right? We talked about the different rationales for mixing. Well, what do I really hope to learn from both of these sets of data sets, right? If I'm not going to ultimately learn anything of interest or important information from that, then I really have no reason to conduct a mixed methods study. So in that case, just do whatever, method addresses my particular question. If I am, then I should consider it. If I do have a rationale and things that I'm really wanting to learn from both sets of data, then at that point in time, I should consider doing mixed methods research. So that's related to the second. Is it really necessary, right, to answer my questions? If it's not, then I should look at other methods or things to do. Could I more effectively, and these are just some questions to think about, like I said, conduct the study using a single approach? And if so, then I should do that, right? There's no reason to make your life more complicated or a problem more complicated than need be. Do I have the skills and resources needed to effectively conduct that, which I mentioned that before. It's quite challenging, it's time consuming, it could be more expensive, and so forth to do all of these things. If I don't have those skills and I need to, increase my own proficiency or consider collaboration and so forth. Okay, here are some references that I used throughout the presentation. Feel free to look at these references as well, and like I said, there's a whole line of literature about some of these topics. All right, so a short introduction. Well, I say short, about an hour or so.